The kitchen at Marchetti's Steakhouse smelled like seared butter and rosemary, and Charlotte Frost had exactly 4 minutes to get herself put back together before her next table sat down. She braced both hands on the edge of the stainless steel prep counter, closed her eyes, and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. It was a trick she'd learned in her first semester of hospitality management at Tarrant County College. A professor with kind eyes and a voice like gravel had told a room full of exhausted students that composure was a skill, not a personality trait, and that anyone could learn it if they practiced enough. Charlotte had practiced a lot. Order up for 11 Shen, called Marcus from the line, sliding 2 plates of dry-aged ribeye across the pass with the easy authority of a man who had been cooking steaks since before Charlotte was born. "And Charlotte, you good Hassans." "I'm great," she said, and meant it the way you mean things you say to survive a Friday night in June when the air conditioning in North Dallas was working overtime against 98 degrees outside, and every table in the dining room was booked through last call. She picked up the plates and pushed through the swinging doors into the dining room where the low gold light and the murmur of 100 quiet conversations wrapped around her like something she'd earned the right to belong inside. Marchetti's on McKinney Avenue was the flagship of the Wilder Hospitality Group. White tablecloths, a wine list 4 pages long, a hostess stand that turned away walk-ins in linen blazers on a Friday night. Charlotte had worked the floor here for 2 years, ever since she'd talked her way into a job with nothing but a community college transcript and a 5-year-old daughter she couldn't afford full-time childcare for. She delivered the ribeyes to table 11, a middle-aged couple celebrating an anniversary. The husband already misty-eyed about it and refilled 2 waters on her way past table 6 and checked her watch and did the math. She did roughly every 90 seconds of every shift. Lily was in the staff dining room in the back, coloring at the little table with the broken caster wheel, and Charlotte had maybe 6 more minutes before she needed to check on her again. The babysitter had canceled at 4:15, a stomach bug she'd said apologetic and useless over the phone. Charlotte had exactly one backup plan, and it was no plan at all. Her mother was 2 states away in Tulsa. Her sister worked nights at the hospital, and Sandra, the restaurant's general manager, had made it very clear during Charlotte's onboarding that Marchetti's was not under any circumstances a place for children. So Charlotte had done the thing she swore she'd never do. She'd brought Lily to work, tucked her into the windowless staff dining room behind the kitchen with a coloring book, a peanut butter sandwich, and a promise. "You have to be a mouse, okay, baby?" she'd whispered, kneeling in front of her daughter, smoothing back the dark hair that was so much like her own. "The quietest mouse in the whole world. Mommy will check on you every little while." "I'm good at being quiet," Lily had said with the grave seriousness of a 5-year-old who understood in the way children understand things without being told that this was important. "I'm the best quiet mouse." Charlotte believed her. Lily had never once in 5 years been anything but easy a child who apologized for needing things, who tucked herself into corners so as not to be underfoot, who had learned far too early that her mother's exhaustion was a fragile thing to be protected. It broke Charlotte's heart a little more each time she saw it. But tonight, it was also the only thing standing between her and unemployment. She slipped back through the kitchen at 7:52, ducked into the staff room, and found Lily exactly where she'd left her tongue, between her teeth coloring a dragon, a shade of purple that did not exist in nature. "Hey, Mouse." Charlotte crouched down and kissed the top of her head. "You doing okay?" "I made the dragon purple because purple is a strong color," Lily said. "Is it still busy?" "So busy, but we're almost done, I promise. You want more juice?" "I'm okay." Lily looked up at her, and there it was again, that careful, watchful look checking her mother's face, the way some children check the sky for rain. "Are you tired?" "A little," Charlotte admitted, because she'd also learned that lying to Lily never worked. The kids saw straight through it. "But happy tired, good tired." "Okay." Lily seemed satisfied by this and went back to her dragon. Charlotte straightened, checked her reflection in the dark window glass. Hair still in its low bun, black button-down, still crisp, no visible evidence of the 4 different fires she'd put out in the last hour, and went back to work. Table 19 in the corner by the window overlooking the patio had been occupied since 7 o'clock by a man Charlotte had served maybe a dozen times over the past year. She didn't know his name. The reservation system only ever said Wilder Party of 1, and she'd assumed when she'd bothered to think about it at all that he was some mid-level executive from one of the office towers on McKinney, The kind of regular who tipped well-ordered the same dry-aged strip every time medium rare and read something on a tablet propped against the breadbasket while he ate. He was maybe 40 silver threading into dark hair at the temples, wearing a gray suit with the jacket folded over the empty chair beside him. He never made a fuss. He said please and thank you to the busser who cleared his bread plate, which was rarer than people like to admit. Once, months ago, when Charlotte had spilled ice water down her own sleeve trying to balance too many glasses at once, he'd been the one to hand her a napkin without comment, like it was the most natural thing in the world, and then gone back to his tablet as if nothing had happened. Tonight he had a glass of Cabernet in front of him half finished, and he looked up when she approached. "How's everything, Mr. Wilder?" "Perfect as always." A small, easy smile. "Busy night." "Very busy," she agreed. "Can I get you anything else?" "Just the check when you have a moment, no rush." "Of course." She was turning away when the trouble started at table 14.
Ta.
It began the way these things always began, quietly, and then not quietly at all. Table 14 was a party of 6 out celebrating someone's promotion at a hedge fund. Charlotte didn't recognize the name of 3 bottles of wine deep and getting louder with each one. She'd noticed them an hour ago, the particular swagger of people who tipped either extravagantly or not at all depending on their mood, and had made a private bet with herself about which way tonight would go. She lost the bet. It went worse than either option. It started with a woman in an emerald dress rising to find the restroom, and passing too close to the kitchen doors and just glancing through the small, round window into the staff dining room where Lily sat coloring under the fluorescent light. "Oh my God," the woman said loudly enough that 4 other tables turned. Is there a child back there?" Charlotte's stomach dropped straight through the floor. "Ma'am, there is a child in the kitchen." The woman said it to her table now, delighted with her own discovery, the way people are delighted by scandal that isn't theirs to bear. In a restaurant like this, can you imagine? Sandra Collins materialized at Charlotte's elbow with the speed of a woman who had radar for exactly this kind of catastrophe. She was 51, sharp-jawed, dressed in the black blazer she wore like armor, and she did not so much walk as arrive. "Is there a problem?" Sandra asked. The table her voice pitched to soothe, already scanning for damage control. "The problem," said our man at the table, silver-haired, expensive watch, the kind of confidence that had never once been told no, "is that I'm paying $300 a head for dinner, and there's apparently a daycare running out of your kitchen." "There's no daycare," Charlotte started. "She's my daughter, and she's not bothering anyone. She's not bothering anyone right now," the man said. "But this is a 5-star establishment, not a diner. I don't come here to have my dinner interrupted by someone's childcare arrangements." Sandra's eyes found Charlotte's, and Charlotte watched something close behind them, not sympathy calculation. A door shutting. "Charlotte!" Sandra's voice had dropped into the register she used for corrections in front of customers, calm and cold, and designed to humiliate efficiently. "We need to talk about this. Now." "Sandra, please, she's not doing anything wrong. She's just sitting quietly. I didn't have anyone to—" "This is completely inappropriate." Sandra wasn't really talking to Charlotte anymore. She was performing for table 14, demonstrating competence, showing the customers that their discomfort mattered more than anything else in the room. "You do not bring a child to a 5-star restaurant. Do you understand how unprofessional this is? Do you understand what this looks like?" "I understand," Charlotte said, and her voice, despite everything, held steady. "That I had no other option tonight, and that she has been completely silent in a closed room for 2 hours, and that no guest has been inconvenienced in any way until this exact moment." "Don't talk back to me in front of guests." "I'm not talking back. I'm explaining, you're done for the night." Sandra's chin lifted. "Go get your things. We'll discuss your continued employment on Monday." The dining room had gone very quiet. Charlotte could feel 24 pairs of eyes on her, feel the heat crawling up her neck and into her face, feel the specific, singular humiliation of being dressed down in public for the crime of being a mother with no safety net. Somewhere behind the kitchen doors, if she'd left them open, even a crack, Lily might be able to hear this. Charlotte prayed she couldn't. "Please," she said, quieter now, all the fight draining out of her and leaving something rawer behind. "I need this job. I have a daughter to take care of. Please don't do this in front of everyone." "You should have thought about that," Sandra said, "before you brought her here." Charlotte felt her eyes burn and hated herself for it. Hated that these people, this table of strangers who would forget her face by tomorrow morning, got to see her come apart. Lily's small hand found hers before she even registered the kitchen door swinging open before she registered her daughter, walking out into the dining room in her socks drawn by some instinct children have for their mother's distress. "Mommy," Lily's voice was very small in the sudden silence. "Are you in trouble?" And that was the moment Charlotte would think later that broke something loose in her chest. Not the humiliation, not Sandra's cold voice, but her daughter's face turned up to hers asking if she was in trouble, as though she believed it might be her own fault. That was also the moment a chair scraped back at table 19. James Wilder rose to his feet. 2 hours earlier, before any of it had started, Dallas had still been gilded with early evening light, the kind that turned the glass towers along McKinney Avenue into long gold mirrors and made the whole city look for about 40 minutes like it had been built specifically to be photographed. Charlotte had walked the 6 blocks from the bus stop to Marchetti's in her work shoes, sweat already gathering at the back of her neck in the June heat, going over the evening's reservations in her head, the way she always did. Anniversary at 11, birthday party of 8 at 15, and a name she didn't recognize attached to table 19. Though she'd learn later that Wilder party of 1 wasn't a name so much as a habit, a man who preferred to be seated the way anyone else would be. The dining room when she'd clocked in at 4 still smelled like the lemon polish the bussers used on the silver and the particular mineral tang of a wine cellar being restocked 1 case at a time. Marcus had been running through the specials with the kind of theatrical seriousness he brought to everything: a dry-aged porterhouse finished in brown butter, a wedge salad with candied pecans, a bourbon reduction. He was inordinately proud of, and Charlotte had scribbled the details on her palm the way she always did out of habit, even though she'd long since memorized the rhythm of a Friday night. She'd called the babysitter at 4:15 expecting to confirm pickup time. She'd gotten an apology and a stomach bug instead, and had stood in the alley behind the restaurant for 3 full minutes with her phone in her hand, running through every option she had and coming up each time with the same conclusion: there was no one else. Her mother was 400 miles away. Her sister worked the overnight shift at Baylor Scott and White and would already be asleep catching what rest she could before a 12-hour rotation. Every other name in her contacts belonged to someone who either couldn't, or in the case of 2 exes she'd long since stopped calling, wouldn't. So she'd walked 6 more blocks to Lily's after-school program, signed her out early, and walked her the rest of the way back to Marchetti's with a coloring book tucked under one arm and a promise already forming on her tongue. "We're going to my work," she'd told Lily, crouching down on the sidewalk outside the after-school building, smoothing her daughter's hair back from her face. "You're going to be the quietest mouse in the whole world, remember, just for a couple hours." Like last time, Lily had asked, because there had been a last time months ago, a shorter shift, an easier night. Like last time, Charlotte had said, and hated faintly how practiced the lie of ease had become between them. Inside, she'd tucked Lily into the staff dining room with the door pulled most of the way shut, a plate from the kitchen's family meal, and the instruction to color as quietly as she could. She'd checked on her 4 times in the first 90 minutes, a habit that cost her nothing on paper and everything in the specific low-grade anxiety of a mother splitting her attention between 2 entirely separate worlds, one built on white tablecloths and $18 cocktails, the other built on a 5-year-old's careful, uncomplaining patience. It was on her 3rd pass through the dining room, delivering a bottle of Cabernet to table 19, that she'd first really registered the regular in the gray suit. Not because he was unusual, but because he was so entirely unremarkable in his kindness that she'd almost missed it. He thanked the busser. He didn't snap his fingers for a refill. When she'd asked out of genuine curiosity rather than professional obligation how his week had been, he'd actually answered something about a supplier delay that had cost him sleep, told without any particular self-importance, as if she were simply a person worth answering honestly. She hadn't thought much more about him. There were 17 tables and 1 daughter to keep track of, and the evening had a rhythm that didn't leave much room for noticing kindness, until it was suddenly, urgently the only thing standing between her and disaster. Mom. By the time the emerald dress woman rose from table 14 and made her fateful pass by the kitchen doors, Charlotte had already refilled 14 waters, delivered 3 entrees, split 1 check 4 ways at a table that couldn't agree on whose card to use, and talked a nervous first date at table 8 through the wine list twice. It had been, by the standards of a Marchetti's Friday, an entirely ordinary night, busy, loud, full of the low-grade chaos that made the job exhausting and on better nights quietly satisfying. She had allowed herself for exactly the length of one bathroom break at 8 o'clock to feel almost proud of how the evening was going, sitter cancellation and all. She would remember that flicker of pride, later turning it over with something between irony and tenderness, because it was the last entirely uncomplicated moment of the night before everything came apart. He didn't rush. That was the first thing Charlotte noticed. Even through the blur of her own humiliation, he crossed the dining room, the way he did everything unhurried, like a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be heard. Sandra. His voice was quiet, but it carried the particular authority of a man who almost never used it. That's enough. Sandra turned, already composing her face into the professional smile she kept for regulars. Mr. Wilder, I'm so sorry this won't affect your evening at all. We're just handling a small staffing. I know exactly what you're handling. He looked at Charlotte, first really looked the way he'd never quite had reason to, before taking in the tears she was blinking back and the small girl gripping her hand like a lifeline. Then his gaze moved to Lily, and something in his expression softened without losing an ounce of its steadiness. Hi there, he said to her, crouching slightly, his voice dropping into something gentler. I like your dragon. Is that purple? Lily blinked up at him, startled out of her fear for just a second. It's a strong color, she said. It really is. He straightened, and when he turned back to the room, his voice had changed again, not louder, but harder, carrying to every corner of the now silent dining room. My name is James Wilder. I'm the founder and owner of Wilder Hospitality. This restaurant and every restaurant in this group exists because of employees like the woman you've just spent the last several minutes humiliating in front of 40 paying customers. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and disbelieving. The man at table 14, the one with the expensive watch, went the particular shade of pale that comes from realizing you've been condescending to the boss's boss without knowing it. Mr. Wilder, Sandra said, and Charlotte watched 2 years of careful managerial polish per crack, straight down the middle. I had no idea. I didn't realize you were... No, James said. You didn't. Which tells me something important about how you treat people you think can't affect your paycheck. He turned to the table of 6. This young woman's daughter has been sitting quietly in a closed staff room for the entirety of your dinner. She has bothered no one. You, on the other hand, have made a public spectacle of a working mother doing her job under difficult circumstances, and you did it loudly enough that I heard it from across the room. I'd ask you to consider that before you order dessert. Nobody at table 14 said anything at all. James turned back to Sandra. Get my head of HR on the phone. Tonight. Mr. Wilder, please, if we could just discuss. There's nothing to discuss. You're terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct toward an employee and her child. Security will help you collect your things. His voice hadn't risen once. That somehow made it worse for Sandra than shouting would have. Charlotte, he said the name carefully, like he wanted to be sure he had it right. Is that your name? Yes, sir. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. You are not in trouble. You have never been in trouble tonight. I'd like you to take your daughter somewhere comfortable, and I'd like you both to have whatever you want from the kitchen on the house. And then I'd like you to go home and rest. Come back Monday, and we'll figure out how the restaurant should have handled this from the start. Because this is not how we handled it. Charlotte stood there with her daughter's hand in hers and 40 strangers watching, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief exactly, but a fierce, uncomfortable awareness that everyone in the room was now looking at her as the woman who'd been rescued. She would think about that discomfort for a long time. Thank you, she said, because it was true, and because there was nothing else to say in the moment. But I can put her in a cab and finish my shift. I don't need... Go home, Charlotte. His voice was kind, but immovable. That's not a suggestion tied to your job. It's just what I'd want for anyone's kid at 8:30 on a Friday. What? He walked them to the door himself, not because it needed to be said to the room again. Charlotte suspected, but because he seemed like a man who finished what he started. Lily walked between them, still holding her mother's hand, glancing up at James every few steps, with an expression somewhere between suspicion and fascination. Are you the boss of the whole restaurant? Lily asked. I'm the boss of a lot of restaurants, James said, matching his pace to her small steps, without seeming to think about it. But I still think your dragon is the best thing I've seen all week. You can have him if you want. I'll draw you a new one. James looked for just a second, entirely undone by this. I would like that very much, he said. At the door, Charlotte turned to him, arms crossed against the night air, feeling the adrenaline drain out of her and leave something colder and more tired behind. I appreciate what you did back there. I do. But I don't want people to think I got special treatment because you happen to be sitting at table 19. You didn't get special treatment, James said. You got treated the way every employee in every one of my restaurants should be treated every night, whether I'm in the room or not. The fact that you weren't is my failure, not your good fortune. She studied him for a moment, the careful gray suit, the quiet certainty, the way he'd crouched down to a 5-year-old's eye level without a second thought, and found she didn't quite know what to do with a rich man who talked like that. Okay, she said finally. Thank you, really. Come back Monday, he said again. I mean that. She came back Monday. She almost didn't. She'd lain awake half of Saturday night, turning it over, the particular vertigo of being both fired and unfired in the same 10 minutes, the sick feeling of imagining herself walking back into that dining room where 40 people had watched her almost fall apart. But rent was due on the 9th, and Lily's preschool tuition didn't care about Charlotte's pride, and so she put on her black button-down and walked back into Marchetti's on Monday morning at 10, expecting an interim manager, expecting awkwardness, expecting anything but what actually happened. James Wilder was sitting at a table in the empty dining room with a legal pad and 2 cups of coffee, and he stood when she walked in. I hope one of these is for me, Charlotte said, because it seemed better than saying any of the things she'd rehearsed. Cream, no sugar? I asked one of the servers what you usually order. He slid the cup toward her as she sat. I wanted to apologize again properly without an audience. What happened Friday should never have happened, and it happened because I built a system where a manager's job security depended more on VIP satisfaction than on basic decency to staff. That's on me. You weren't the one who said those things. No. But I'm the one who hired the person who did and never checked how she treated the people under her. He turned the legal pad so she could see at bullet points half a page of notes already. I've spent the weekend thinking about what actually needs to change here, and I don't want to do it in a vacuum. You've worked the floor longer than almost anyone on staff. I'd like your opinion. Charlotte wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, buying herself a second to think. You want my opinion on restaurant policy? I want the opinion of someone who's actually lived the consequences of bad policy, yes. She studied him. There was no performance in it. None of the theater she half expected from a man who'd just fired someone in front of a packed dining room 3 nights ago. He looked, if anything, a little tired himself, like a man who'd genuinely spent the weekend doing homework instead of forgetting the whole thing over golf. Okay, she said slowly. First thing, emergency childcare shouldn't be a firing offense. It should be a policy. Half your staff are parents. Sitters cancel. Kids get sick. If you don't have a plan for that, you're just waiting for the next Friday night. He was already writing. Second thing, she went on, warming slightly to the subject, managers shouldn't have unilateral firing power over customer complaints. Not without review. Sandra made a call in 90 seconds that would have ended my ability to pay rent based on nothing but a stranger's discomfort. Agreed. HR review before any termination tied to a customer complaint starting this week. And, Charlotte said more quietly now, if you're going to fix this, fix it because it's right. Not because it looked bad on somebody's phone by Saturday morning. Something shifted in his face, not offense, she thought, but recognition. Is that what you think this is? I don't know what this is yet, she said honestly. I just know I don't want to be the reason a rich man felt good about himself for a week and then went back to business as usual. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that made her feel unexpectedly seen, and then he closed the legal pad and set his pen down. Then hold me to it, he said. Not just this week. Ask me in 3 months whether anything's actually different. I'd rather be held accountable by someone who worked the floor than praised by someone who didn't. Charlotte hadn't expected that answer, and it cost her something to admit quietly to herself over coffee she hadn't asked for and hadn't expected to like this much that she believed him. Over the following weeks, James became a more frequent presence at Marchetti's, not swooping in with clipboards and consultants, but simply showing up most evenings at his usual table by the window, ordering his usual steak, reading his tablet. Except now he talked to Charlotte when she passed, asked how the new interim manager was working out, asked carefully, like he was checking a fact rather than fishing for information how Lily was doing. She asked about the Purple Dragon Man again. Charlotte told him one slow Tuesday, refilling his water without needing to be asked. I think you made an impression. I still have him, James said. taped to my office door. My assistant thinks I've lost my mind. Have you? A little, he admitted. And there was something in the way he said it, self-deprecating, unguarded, that made Charlotte laugh for the first time in what felt like weeks. It became without either of them quite naming it a kind of rhythm. He'd ask about the new scheduling software the corporate office was piloting, the one Charlotte had suggested after their first conversation. She'd ask in turn what it was like to run a company that big, whether he ever regretted it. He told her one evening in early July about the divorce that had ended 6 years ago. No bitterness in it, just a plain accounting of a marriage that had run its course before either of them had the courage to say so out loud, and about the fact that he'd never had children of his own. A fact he mentioned so simply that Charlotte understood without being told that it was a small grief he carried quietly. "You're good with her, though," Charlotte said. "With Lily. Better than most people who have kids." "She reminds me it's possible to just be honest with someone," James said. "Adults complicate that. Kids don't." Charlotte thought about that for days afterward, about a man who ran a company with 4,000 employees and still found the most honest conversation of his week with a 5-year-old's purple dragon. She started without entirely meaning to looking forward to Tuesdays. It was Lily who noticed first the way children notice things adults spend enormous effort not noticing about themselves. "Do you like Mr. James?" she asked one night out of nowhere while Charlotte braided her hair before bed. "I like him fine, baby. He's been very kind to us." "No, but do you like him?" Lily twisted around to study her mother's face with the same grave seriousness she brought to dragon coloring. "Like how the princess likes the prince in my book." "It's not like that," Charlotte said, and heard, even as she said it, that it came out a beat too fast to be entirely convincing. "He's my boss's boss, that's all." Lily considered this with the patience of a very small judge weighing evidence. "Okay," she said, finally, clearly unconvinced, and went back to holding still for her braid. Charlotte lay awake later that night, turning her daughter's question over like a stone in her palm, uncomfortable with how long she sat with it before setting it down. Word of what had happened at Marchetti's moved through the rest of the Wilder hospitality properties the way these things always did, not through any official channel, but through the invisible network of servers and line cooks and hosts who all knew each other from culinary school or previous jobs or simple proximity, texting each other half-formed accounts before anyone in corporate had said a word. By the following Tuesday, Charlotte had fielded 3 separate calls from friends at other restaurants in the group, all wanting to know if it was true that the owner himself had fired a manager on the spot, all delivering the story back to her slightly changed each time until she barely recognized her own Friday night in the retelling. "They're saying he carried you out of the restaurant," said Priya, a server Charlotte had trained alongside at a different location 2 years earlier, calling during her own break with poorly disguised delight. "Like over his shoulder, fireman style." "He walked us to the door," Charlotte said. "That's it. That's the whole story." "That is not the whole story, and you know it because apparently he's been in for lunch 3 times this week, which he never used to do." Charlotte hadn't had a good answer for that, mostly because she'd noticed the same thing herself and hadn't wanted to examine it too closely. The interim manager, corporate, sent to cover Sandra's old position, was a woman named Patrice Okafor, brought over from a sister property in Fort Worth with 15 years of hospitality management behind her and absolutely no patience for anything Sandra Collins would have tolerated. Within her first week, Patrice had instituted a rotating on-call list for staff emergencies, posted a laminated sheet by the time clock explaining the new HR review process for any termination, and pulled Charlotte aside personally to say she'd read the incident report and thought Charlotte had handled an impossible situation about as well as anyone could have. "For what it's worth," Patrice said, refilling her own coffee in the break room at the start of a slow Sunday shift, "I don't think what happened to you was really about a 5-year-old sitting quietly in a back room. I think it was about a manager who'd been taught somewhere along the way that her job was to protect the restaurant's image instead of the people who make the restaurant run. That's a management failure. It was never yours." "I appreciate you saying that. I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it's what I actually think, and because I'd rather you hear it from me than spend the next 6 months wondering if everyone here secretly believes you got special treatment." Patrice studied her for a moment. "Do you want special treatment, Charlotte?" "No," Charlotte said without hesitation. "I really don't." "Good. Because you're not going to get any from me. But you are going to get a fair shot, which I gather is a different thing than what you've had here before." Charlotte thought about that conversation more than once, Over the following weeks, the plain, unsentimental fairness of it so different from either Sandra's cold calculation or the uncomfortable, unearned sympathy she got from strangers who recognized her from the video. Patrice never once mentioned James Wilder's name in connection with anything Charlotte did. It was Charlotte realized slowly exactly the kind of workplace she'd been trying to build a career inside of all along, and it had taken a public humiliation to finally get it. James's visits to Marchetti's settled into an easy rhythm through the height of a Dallas summer that refused to relent below 95 degrees even after sundown. He came on Tuesdays, mostly when the dining room ran slower and there was time for actual conversation between courses, rather than the clipped efficiency of a Friday rush. He asked about Patrice's changes, about the new scheduling software, about a wine rep who'd been trying to get Marchetti's to carry an overpriced Malbec nobody actually liked. He asked more carefully about Lily not fishing exactly, but genuinely curious in the particular way of a man unused to being curious about children and finding to his own quiet surprise that he liked it. She drew me a whole family of dragons last week, Charlotte told him, one evening setting down his water glass. Said the purple one from before had gotten lonely. Did she name them? Gerald. All of them are named Gerald. She says it's less confusing that way. James laughed a real laugh, unguarded, the kind Charlotte hadn't heard from him in the 2 months she'd known him. I would like to formally request an introduction to the Geralds. I'll pass along the request. She's very particular about who gets Gerald privileges. I understand there's a rigorous approval process. Extremely rigorous. You'll need references. It became, over those slow Tuesday evenings, a kind of easy shorthand between them, jokes that belonged only to the two of them, the specific pleasure of being known well enough by someone that half a sentence carried a whole conversation. Charlotte noticed with some discomfort that she'd started dressing a little more carefully on Tuesdays and told herself it had nothing to do with anything beyond simple professionalism, and didn't entirely believe herself when she said it. The story of what had happened at Marchetti's found its way onto social media by the following Wednesday. A diner at table 14 that night, it turned out, had filmed part of it on her phone, and by the time the video finished making its rounds, it had 2 million views and a headline calling James Wilder the billionaire who stood up for a single mom. Local news picked it up. Then a national morning show called The Corporate Office, asking for an interview. Charlotte found out about the video from her sister, who sent it to her with 7 exclamation points. And the caption is "This you," and spent an uncomfortable 10 minutes watching herself from a stranger's shaky phone camera, small and stricken in the corner of the frame, while a man she was still getting to know rose to defend her. She did not enjoy being famous for 90 seconds of the worst night of her working life. James, for his part, seemed to enjoy it even less. When Charlotte saw him that Friday, he looked like a man who'd spent the week fielding phone calls he didn't want to take. "Corporate wants me to do the interview," he said without preamble, sliding into his usual seat. "They think it's good for the brand. Genuine values, employee-first culture, all of it. Is it not true?" "It's true. I still don't love being asked to perform it for cameras." He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "They also want to fast-track your promotion. Get you into a management role within the month. Good optics, they keep saying. A single mom who got humiliated becomes a manager. Great story plays well, generates goodwill." Charlotte set down the water pitcher she'd been holding and looked at him directly. "No. I told them the same thing for what it's worth. But I wanted to hear it from you before I said no on your behalf." "I mean it, James. No." She said his first name without quite meaning to, and neither of them commented on it. "If I get promoted next month, everyone in this building will know exactly why. They'll say I slept my way up, or that I got lucky, or that the owner felt sorry for me. I will spend the rest of my career here being the girl the CEO rescued. I won't do that. Not to myself, and not to Lily, who's going to grow up and Google her mother's name someday." James was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again there was something like relief in his voice. "That's what I thought you'd say." "So what did you tell them?" "That you'd be entering the management training program like everyone else. Same application, same interviews, same evaluation panel. People who have no idea who you are to me because, frankly, there isn't a who you are to me beyond a colleague I respect. You'll compete on the merits. And if you don't make it, you don't make it. And that's the answer we give the cameras, too." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, the plainness of the offer, no strings folded into it anywhere she could find. "That's fair," she said finally. "That's more than fair. It's the only version I'd feel right about," James said. "I don't want credit for giving you an opportunity. I want you to take one and earn the rest yourself. The Wilder Hospitality Management Training Program ran 12 weeks, and it did not care that Charlotte Frost had once been rescued on camera by the man who owned the company. It cared about inventory management and labor cost percentages, and how you handled a walk-in party of 14 with no reservation on a Saturday night. It cared whether you could read a P&L statement, whether you could de-escalate an angry customer without losing your staff's respect, whether you could run a full-service dinner shift as manager on duty, while someone with a clipboard stood in the corner taking notes on everything you did wrong. Charlotte enrolled with 41 other candidates from restaurants across the Dallas-Fort Worth region. She was by a wide margin the only one juggling a full course load at Tarrant County College, a full-time serving job to pay rent, and a 5-year-old who still needed her hair braided every morning and her nightmares chased away most nights. She did it anyway. She studied at the kitchen table after Lily fell asleep. Textbooks and program materials spread across the same surface where she cut up quesadillas and helped with kindergarten homework. She practiced mock evaluations in the shower, running through de-escalation scripts under the hot water because it was the only 20 minutes of the day that belonged entirely to her. She fell asleep some nights with a highlighter still in her hand and woke up with ink on her cheek and exactly enough time to get Lily dressed and out the door. "You look tired, Mommy," Lily said one morning, studying her over a bowl of cereal with the particular scrutiny only a 5-year-old could get away with. "Good tired," Charlotte said the way she always did. "I'm building something, baby. It just takes a lot of work." "Like a fort." "Kind of like a fort." Charlotte kissed the top of her head. "A really big one, with a roof that doesn't leak." James did not sit in on her evaluations. He made a point, in fact, of being visibly absent from anything related to the program. No visits to her sessions, no check-ins with the panel, no mentions of her name in any meeting where it might tilt a scale, even a fraction of a degree. Charlotte found out later from one of the other candidates that he'd specifically recused himself from the entire selection process the moment her application came in, handing oversight to a regional VP. He trusted precisely because the man had never once cared whose face was on the news. They still talked on the evenings she worked her regular shifts standing near the server station during slow moments or sometimes over a rushed 10 minutes in the break room. He asked about her coursework. She asked about a supplier dispute he was navigating with a produce vendor in Fort Worth. Once, when she admitted she was exhausted enough to cry in the walk-in cooler for 4 minutes before a shift, he didn't offer to fix it, just listened and told her she was allowed to be tired without it, meaning she was failing. "You say that like you've had practice being exhausted," she said. "I built this company from one diner on Greenville Avenue," James said. "There were a few years where I slept in the office more than my own apartment. I know what it costs to build something. I just got to do it without anyone else depending on me to come home." "That sounds lonely." "It was," he said simply. "Still is some nights." Neither of them said anything else about it. But Charlotte thought about it later, washing dishes at 11 at night with Lily asleep down the hall, and found herself wondering what it would be like to come home to someone who understood exactly what a long day cost.
Yes.
The final assessment for the program ran over 3 days in October. A live evaluation during real dinner service at 3 different properties, judged by an independent panel flown in from the company's other regional markets. People who had never set foot in Dallas and had no idea that one of the 42 candidates in front of them had ever been on the news. Charlotte ran her assigned dinner shift at a Wilder hospitality property in Uptown. She'd never worked at before with a floor staff she'd never managed before on a Thursday night that decided with the perverse timing of the universe to throw everything at her at once. A walk-in party of 16 with no reservation, a kitchen running short a line. Cook a wine delivery that arrived an hour late, and a genuinely furious customer convinced he'd been overcharged for a bottle he'd in fact ordered himself. She handled all of it. Not perfectly, she'd admit later there were 3 separate moments she thought she'd blown the whole evaluation, but with the specific hard-won competence of someone who had spent 2 years learning exactly how a dining room breaks under pressure and exactly how to hold it together anyway. She calmed the furious customer by pulling the itemized check and walking him through it line by line, patient and unhurried, the way she'd learned to be patient with people who were embarrassed and covering it with anger. She reorganized the floor staff sections on the fly to cover the walk-in party without slowing anyone else down. She apologized to the wine delivery driver by name and had him back on the road in 4 minutes flat. At the end of the night, one of the panel judges, a woman named Renata Cole, regional VP from the Houston market, who Charlotte had never met before that evening, and who had no reason on earth to know or care who Charlotte Frost was, pulled her aside near the host stand. "I've evaluated 11 candidates this cycle," Renata said, closing her folder. "You just ran the cleanest recovery from a bad night I've seen all year. I don't care what your resume says. That's the job." Charlotte didn't cry until she got to her car. The results were posted the following Monday, ranked and scored 42 names on a single sheet. No names attached to any story anyone had ever seen on the news. Charlotte Frost ranked first. She read it twice in the corporate office lobby, waiting for someone to tell her it was a mistake, waiting for the particular disbelief that comes when you've wanted something so badly for so long that having it feels unreal. Nobody told her it was a mistake. A woman from HR shook her hand and told her congratulations, and handed her a folder with the words "Assistant Restaurant Manager" typed across the top, and Charlotte stood in that lobby holding proof, real, independently verified proof that she had built the things she'd set out to build with her own hands, on her own time while nobody was watching who mattered. James found out the same way everyone else did from the posted results. No advance notice, no back channel. He read the list standing in his own office with his door closed, and when he got to the top of the sheet and saw her name sitting above 41 other candidates who'd had none of her disadvantages and all of her competition, something in his chest went entirely quietly still. He would tell her much later that it wasn't the moment he started caring about her. That had happened weeks before in increments too small to name a purple dragon, a Tuesday conversation, 4 minutes of honesty in a walk-in cooler. But it was the moment he stopped pretending even to himself that what he felt for Charlotte Frost had anything to do with rescue or gratitude or the easy narrative a camera phone had tried to hand him. It was the moment he understood, watching her name at the top of a list she'd earned entirely without him, that he had fallen in love with a woman who had never once needed saving, only a fair chance, which was a much smaller thing to give and a much larger thing to watch her use. The other candidates in the management training program noticed her before she'd said a single word to any of them, and not in a way that made the first week easy. Charlotte recognized the particular quality of the attention, sidelong glances during orientation, a hush that fell over small conversations when she walked into a room, the specific discomfort of being simultaneously famous and unwelcome. A man named Todd Briers, who'd been a floor manager at one of the group's Fort Worth locations for 6 years and had clearly expected this cycle's promotion to be a formality, made a point of asking loudly enough for the room to hear whether Charlotte thought the program would be harder or easier for her given everything. "Same as everyone else," Charlotte said, meeting his eyes evenly. 42 candidates, one scorecard. "I'd assume you'd want it that way too, unless you think you need an advantage over me to win fairly." Todd hadn't had a response for that, and the room's attention had shifted subtly into something closer to respect. It didn't erase the underlying tension entirely. Charlotte still caught the occasional comment, not quite meant for her ears, still felt the particular loneliness of being watched more closely than anyone else in the room, waiting to see if she'd stumble in a way that would confirm what everyone assumed about how she'd gotten there. But she found as the weeks went on that the work itself was the best answer she had. She outscored Todd on the first written labor cost exam by 6 points. She ran a cleaner mock evaluation than 3 of the program's strongest candidates during the October practicum. By the 9th week, the sidelong glances had mostly stopped, replaced by something more grudging and more genuine, the specific respect professionals extend to someone they've watched actually do the work. The nights were the hardest part, harder even than the exams. Lily had started in October, waking at 2 or 3 in the morning. With bad dreams, she couldn't quite explain nothing specific. Nothing Charlotte could point to and fix just the ordinary nighttime fears of a 5-year-old whose mother was more tired than usual and whose routine had shifted in ways too subtle for a child to name, but not too subtle to feel. "Stay," Lily would say, small and half asleep, patting the space beside her in the dark. "Just for a little bit." And Charlotte would stay always, every time, no matter how much reading waited for her at the kitchen table, no matter how early the alarm would ring, because there was no textbook chapter worth more than her daughter's small hand finding hers in the dark and holding on until the fear passed. She fell behind on her coursework twice that fall because of it, and caught back up both times by trading sleep for study in the gray hour before dawn, and told no one at the program about any of it, because she'd learned a long time ago that exhaustion explained to the wrong person sounded like an excuse, and she had no intention of giving anyone a reason to discount her work as anything less than earned. She told James once on a Tuesday evening in late September, mostly because he asked, and mostly because something about the particular quiet of an empty dining room after close made honesty easier than it usually was. "I don't know how you're doing all of this," he said when she'd finished. Not pity, something closer to plain astonishment. The program alone would exhaust most people. You're doing it with a full course load and a 5-year-old who needs you at 3 in the morning. "I don't really have a choice," Charlotte said. "That's not a complaint. It's just true. Nobody's coming to trade places with me for a night so I can catch up on sleep." "No," James agreed quietly. "I don't imagine anyone is." He was quiet for a moment, turning his water glass a slow quarter turn, the same nervous habit she'd notice again, weeks later, under very different circumstances. "I used to think I understood what hard work looked like building this company from one restaurant. I'm starting to think I only understood the version of it that came with a safety net I never had to think about using." "It's not a competition," Charlotte said, gentler than she meant to be. "I'm not trying to make you feel guilty for how you built anything." "I know, I just think it's worth being honest about the difference instead of pretending the playing field was ever level to begin with." He looked at her steady. "For what it's worth, I think what you're doing is the hardest, most impressive thing I've watched anyone do in a long time. I wanted you to hear that from someone who's actually paying attention, not from a stranger's phone video." Charlotte didn't have a ready answer for that. She only knew walking home that night under a sky gone soft and orange with the last of a Dallas sunset that she'd carried the sentence with her the rest of the evening like something warm held carefully in both hands. The promotion changed things at Marchetti's in ways both large and small. Charlotte moved off the floor and into the small manager's office behind the kitchen. The same office she realized on her first day where Sandra used to sit with the door closed. Though it looked entirely different now, with Charlotte's textbooks stacked on the shelf and a purple crayon drawing of a dragon taped at Lily's insistence to the inside of the door where only Charlotte would see it. Some of the staff who doubted her quietly in the way people doubt a single mother, promoted after a viral video assuming favor, where there had only been merit came around within the first month. Once they saw how she ran a shift fare, come quick to notice when someone was struggling before it became a crisis. Quicker still to defend her staff to a difficult table the way she'd once needed someone to defend her. A server named Dana, who'd been openly skeptical in the break room back in July, told Charlotte in September that she'd never worked for a manager who actually remembered everyone's names, including the dishwashers. "You remember things because you were on that side of it 2 months ago," Dana said. "I remember things because it's not that hard," Charlotte said. "It's just easier to forget when you don't have to." James came in less often after her promotion, and at first she wondered with a small private ache she didn't examine too closely whether it meant something had cooled. She understood the real reason on a slow Tuesday in late September when he finally sat down at his old table and admitted it outright. "I stayed away for a while," he said, "because I didn't want anyone thinking I was checking up on you, or checking up on anything else." He turned his water glass a quarter turn, a small, nervous gesture she'd never seen from him before. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something for a few weeks now, and I keep talking myself out of it because I don't want you to feel like there's any pressure attached to it, given everything." Charlotte set down her clipboard. "Say it anyway." "I admired you before I realized I loved you," James said. "I want to be clear about the order of those two things, because I think it matters. I noticed you long before Sandra ever opened her mouth the way you talked to the elderly regulars, the way you never once looked annoyed with a table that changed their order 4 times. I admired you as an employee for a long time before any of the rest of it started, and then somewhere in the last few months, admiration turned into something I didn't expect and didn't especially want, given who I am to this company and who you are to it. But I don't think I get to keep pretending it isn't there. So that's what I wanted to say." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, feeling something in her chest crack open in a way that was equal parts terrifying and enormous. "I've been afraid of this conversation," she admitted finally. "Not because I don't feel something back, I do, and I have for a while, and it scares me more than the management exam did. I'm afraid that if we do this, everyone who worked so hard to believe I earned my promotion will decide retroactively that I didn't. That dating the owner erases every 12-hour shift every night I studied at my kitchen table until midnight. I fought too hard for people to see me as competent. I don't want to hand them a reason to unsee it." Then we don't hide it and we don't rush it, and we let the record speak for itself, James said. You ranked first out of 42 candidates before either of us said a word about any of this. That's public record. Nobody gets to rewrite that just because we're honest about something that happened after. And if they try anyway, then they're wrong and will survive people being wrong about us. It's not the first time, and it won't be the last. He met her eyes steady. I'm not asking you to define yourself by anything but your own work, Charlotte. I never will. I just don't want to keep pretending I don't think about you when I'm not here. Charlotte laughed a short, surprised, unguarded sound, the first real laugh she'd let herself have about any of this. You think about me at your billion-dollar company meetings. Embarrassingly often, James admitted. My CFO asked me twice last week if I was paying attention. I wasn't. That's genuinely terrible for shareholders. They'll survive it too. But they took things slowly, deliberately, the way two people build something meant to last rather than something meant to be photographed. Dinner twice at a small place in Oak Cliff, neither of them had ever been recognized at. A Saturday afternoon at the Dallas Arboretum that Lily insisted on attending on the grounds that any outing without her was by definition incomplete. Lily adjudicated the whole relationship with the seriousness of a small judge presiding over the most important case of her career. She asked James pointed questions. Did he like dogs? Did he know how to make grilled cheese? Was he going to make her mommy sad ever? And seemed satisfied week by week with his answers. It was on an ordinary Wednesday in October, walking to the car after an afternoon at the park, that Lily asked the question that undid James Wilder more completely than a viral video or a management scorecard ever had. Mr. James, she said, swinging her small hand in his, entirely unaware of what she was about to do to a grown man's composure. My kindergarten is having family day next month. Everyone gets to bring 2 grown-ups. I only have mommy. She looked up at him with an expression that was not quite a question and not quite a request, something more careful and more hopeful than either. Would you come? Everyone else has 2 grown-ups, and I only have one, and I don't want to be the only one with just one. James stopped walking. Charlotte, a step ahead, turned back and saw something move across his face she hadn't seen there before. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of quiet devastation, the particular grief of a man who'd spent years believing he'd never be asked a question like that, standing very still in a parking lot while a 5-year-old asked it anyway. I would be honored, he said, and his voice wasn't quite steady when he said it. I would absolutely be there. Really, 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 really. He crouched down to her eye level the same way he had that first night at Marchetti's months and a lifetime ago. I'll even wear a nice shirt. You always wear nice shirts. A nicer one, then. Lily nodded, satisfied the matter closed with the finality of a 5-year-old who has secured exactly what she came for and skipped ahead toward the car. Charlotte stood there, watching him straighten up, watching him blink hard against something he clearly hadn't expected to feel in a parking lot on a Wednesday afternoon, and felt her own throat tighten in response. You okay? She asked quietly. I never thought I'd get asked something like that, James said. I made peace with not having kids a long time ago. I told myself it was fine. Mostly it was fine. He looked toward the car where Lily was climbing into her booster seat, narrating the whole process to herself in a running commentary only she could hear. It's a strange thing having a 5-year-old undo 8 years of careful acceptance in one sentence in a parking lot. She has that effect on people. She has that effect on me, James said, and something in the way he said it, plain, unguarded, entirely without performance, told Charlotte everything she needed to know about where this was going and how little either of them intended to slow it down anymore. But not everyone at Marchetti's took the news of James and Charlotte's relationship as evenly as Dana had. Charlotte heard secondhand and through the particular grapevine that runs through every restaurant kitchen in America that a busser named Ricky had made a comment in the alley one night about how it must be nice to date your way to the top, and that Patrice, who had overheard it, had shut the conversation down so fast and so completely that Ricky hadn't repeated the sentiment again, at least not where anyone could hear it. Charlotte found out about it a week later from Patrice herself, delivered without drama over coffee in the manager's office. I want you to know I handled it, Patrice said. Not because I think you couldn't have, but because it's my job to make sure this kitchen doesn't run on rumors about my GM's personal life. You earned your title before any of this started. Anyone who says otherwise is wrong, and I'll keep correcting them for as long as I need to. I don't want you fighting my battles for me. I'm not fighting your battles. I'm doing my job, which happens to include not letting my staff disrespect their manager based on gossip. Patrice studied her for a moment. You're allowed to have a personal life, Charlotte. You're also allowed to let people be wrong about it without proving anything to them. You proved what you needed to prove months ago on a scorecard nobody can argue with. Charlotte held on to that conversation more than she expected to. The specific relief of being defended. Not out of sentiment, but out of simple, unglamorous fairness, the same quality she'd first recognized in James back when she'd had no reason yet to trust it. James told her one evening in late October about the year after his divorce, a detail he'd mentioned before only in passing, never with the particulars. They'd been married 9 years, he and his ex-wife. Both of them young and ambitious, when they'd started both of them slowly discovering they wanted very different lives by the time they'd built the version they had. There had been no dramatic betrayal, no single unforgivable moment. Just a long, quiet erosion, two people growing into different shapes, until the marriage no longer fit either of them. I used to think the hardest part was the divorce itself, James said. It wasn't. The hardest part was the year after when the company was still growing and I had nobody to come home to and tell about it. I started staying at the office later than I needed to, not because the work required it, but because an empty apartment felt worse than an empty conference room. Is that still true? Not anymore, James said, and didn't elaborate further and didn't need to. Charlotte found herself in the weeks that followed thinking less about the distance between his life and hers, the restaurants he owned, outright. The trip she'd never taken, the version of stability she'd spent her whole adult life chasing, that he'd simply been born standing on, and more about the plain, unglamorous loneliness underneath all of it, a loneliness that looked from the inside remarkably similar to her own. I used to think rich people didn't get lonely, she admitted to him once, like the money bought you out of it somehow. It buys you a bigger apartment to be lonely in, James said. That's about the extent of it. Lily's family day invitation arrived on a Tuesday, a bright construction paper flyer stapled to her backpack with a cartoon apple in the corner, and a request in the kindergarten teacher's careful handwriting that families bring up to 2 special grown-ups to share in a morning of activities. Charlotte had read it twice at the kitchen table that evening, feeling the particular ache of a single parent confronting yet again a form built for a family shape. She didn't have the 2 special grown-ups assumed by default, the quiet exclusion built into even the most well-meaning school flyer. She hadn't planned to bring it up with James at all. It had been Lily who'd solved the problem in her own 5-year-old way, in a parking lot on an ordinary Wednesday, asking a question so plainly that neither adult in her life had room left to overthink an answer. Charlotte thought, watching James crouch down to Lily's height in that parking lot, about all the ways she'd braced herself over the years for the world to remind her daughter that their family looked different from most the school forms. The birthday party invitations addressed to mom and dad. The quiet, persistent architecture of a world built around 2-parent households. She hadn't expected the answer to that ache to arrive wearing a gray suit and crouching down on asphalt to look a 5-year-old in the eye. But she found watching it happen that she wasn't going to question a gift simply because it had come from an unexpected direction. The Dallas Arboretum in October was full of the particular gold light that made even the most ordinary Saturday feel like something worth remembering. Sugar maples just beginning to turn along the White Rock Lake shoreline, the gardens still holding on to the last of their late summer color before the season shifted for good. Lily had run ahead of them down the path toward the children's garden, arms out like an airplane, shouting something about a fountain she remembered from a school field trip the previous spring, and Charlotte had found herself walking beside James in a silence that felt for the first time in months entirely unhurried. "Can I ask you something?" Charlotte said, watching Lily crouch by a bed of chrysanthemums up ahead. "That isn't really about any of this. About us, I mean. Of course. Do you regret not having kids before all this? Before Lily?" James was quiet for a moment, watching Lily wave both arms at a squirrel that had no interest in acknowledging her. "I used to tell myself I didn't," he said finally. "It was easier than sitting with the actual answer. The truth is I wanted them for a long time, and it just didn't happen for us. And by the time the marriage ended, I'd built a whole framework of acceptance around a life without them because the alternative was grieving something I couldn't get back." He glanced at Charlotte. "I don't know if that's regret exactly. It's more like a room in a house you stopped going into because it hurt too much to look at what was supposed to be in it. And now I find myself standing in that room again," James said. Except it doesn't hurt anymore, it's just full of purple dragons. Charlotte laughed, but it came out thinner than she meant it to her throat tight, with something she hadn't expected to feel on an ordinary Saturday at the Arboretum. She reached over and took his hand, not making a production of it, just a simple fact of two people walking down a garden path together, and felt him fold his fingers around hers like it was the easiest, most natural thing in the world. Ahead of them, Lily had abandoned the squirrel and was now attempting to teach a very patient stranger's golden retriever to shake hands, narrating the entire process to the dog in a tone of great seriousness. Neither Charlotte nor James hurried to intervene. Some afternoon, Charlotte was learning were better left exactly as unhurried as they wanted to be. Family Day at Lily's kindergarten fell on a bright cold Thursday in November, the kind of Dallas morning where the sky goes a hard, clean blue and everyone pretends it's colder than it actually is. James arrived in a blue button-down, not his nicest shirt. Charlotte would tease him later, but a good try, and sat cross-legged on a classroom rug meant for children half his size, helping Lily glue construction paper leaves onto a paper tree, while 11 other 5-year-olds and their assorted grown-ups filled the small classroom with noise. "You're really good at this," Lily informed him, studying his leaf placement with a critic's eye. "I had a good teacher," James said, and glanced up at Charlotte standing near the doorway with her arms crossed, and her heart doing something complicated and enormous in her chest, watching a billionaire in a slightly too nice shirt argue seriously with a 5-year-old about whether a leaf should go on the left branch or the right. She thought watching him about the version of that Friday night in June that could have happened instead. Sandra's voice, the silent dining room, the particular loneliness of being humiliated in public with nobody willing to say a word. She thought about how close that night had come to simply ending her at Marchetti's, one more single mother whose circumstances had been treated as a character flaw. And she thought about the distance between that night and this one measured not in months, but in every 12-hour shift every night at the kitchen table, with a highlighter every ounce of stubborn insistence that she would earn whatever came next rather than accept it as a gift. It had been a gift in the end in its way. James's fairness, his refusal to let the story become about his own generosity, his quiet insistence that she compete on nothing but her own merit. But the promotion, the title, the life she was building, those were hers. She had never once let anyone hand them to her. The changes at Wilder Hospitality came slower than the changes in Charlotte's own life, but they came, and they came for good. By the following spring, the company had rolled out an employee family support initiative across all 41 of its restaurants, emergency childcare stipends for staff whose regular arrangements fell through flexible scheduling protections for single parents that couldn't be overridden by a manager's discretion, and a scholarship fund seeded with James's own money and matched by the company for any employee pursuing a hospitality degree while working full-time. Charlotte had sat on the committee that designed it, insisting over the objections of 2 corporate lawyers that the policy be written by people who'd actually needed it, rather than people imagining what might be needed. "You built half of this," James told her the day the initiative launched company-wide. "We built it," Charlotte said. "I just made sure it actually solved the problem instead of just looking like it did." She graduated from Tarrant County College the following May with honors in hospitality management. Lily in the audience, in a small dress she'd picked out herself, clapping so hard, her small hands turned pink, shouting, "That's my mommy!" loudly enough that half the auditorium turned to look, and Charlotte didn't care one bit. 3 months later, she was named general manager of the Marchetti's flagship on McKinney Avenue, the same restaurant where she'd once been fired and unfired in the same 10 minutes, the same dining room where 40 strangers had once watched her nearly come apart. The promotion went through an outside evaluation panel, same as every management position at Wilder Hospitality now did. James recused himself from the process entirely, the same as he always had. Charlotte earned it on the numbers, the P&Ls she'd turned around at her assistant manager, post the staff retention rate that had climbed under her leadership, the customer satisfaction scores that outpaced every comparable property in the region. Nobody who worked there needed to be told twice why she'd gotten the job. The evening of her first shift as general manager, Charlotte stood at the host stand at 6 o'clock, watching the dining room fill with the particular gold light and low murmur she'd loved from the very first week she'd worked there back when she'd been 24, and exhausted and entirely uncertain whether any of this would ever add up to something. James came in at 7, same table by the window, same easy, unhurried walk, and she felt the same small lift in her chest, She always felt when she saw him now, 2 years into whatever this had become. Steady, unshowy, entirely unlike anything either of them had expected to find on a Friday night that had started out as a disaster. "Table for one?" she asked straight-faced when he reached the stand. "Actually," he said, "I was hoping for a table for three. My date's daughter insisted on coming." "Your date's daughter has strong opinions about the menu. I've heard. Apparently the mac and cheese is the best in Dallas, and she'd like it noted for the record." Lily arrived a few minutes later, hair in the same braid Charlotte had done that morning, and ran the full length of the dining room to throw her arms around both of them at once, unbothered by the white tablecloths or the murmured conversations, or the general sense that 5-year-olds weren't meant to sprint through five-star dining rooms. Charlotte caught her laughing and felt James's hand come to rest lightly at the small of her back, and thought not for the first time about how strange and enormous it was that the worst night of her working life had somehow led directly to this one. Above the entrance, where a small brass plaque had once listed the restaurant's original 1987 founding date, there was a new motto now added at James's insistence the month after that first video had gone viral. Not a marketing line dreamed up by a PR firm, but 8 words he'd written himself the night after he'd fired Sandra Collins and spent the following 2 days rebuilding a company's values from the ground up. Great restaurants don't just serve meals, they honor people. Charlotte had read it 100 times by now, walking under it every morning she came in to open, every evening she stayed late to close. Tonight, seating James and Lily at their usual table before she went back to running her dining room, she read it once more and felt for the first time in longer than she could remember that the words had stopped being an aspiration and become simply a fact. Across the room before she turned back to the podium, her eyes met James's, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. They were both thinking about the same night, the emerald dress, and the cruel laughter, the chair scraping back at table 19. The small hand slipping into hers, asking if she was in trouble, and both of them understood without a single word passing between them that it had been the night everything worth having in either of their lives had actually begun. Lily, unaware of any of it, was already asking the server for extra crayons. The end. Chat. The family support initiative did not roll out without resistance. 2 board members had pushed back hard in the planning stages, arguing that the emergency childcare stipend set a costly precedent and that flexible scheduling protections would create staffing headaches across 41 properties. James had sat through that meeting according to the regional VP, who told Charlotte about it afterward without raising his voice once, and had simply asked the board a single question: how much had the company spent in the 6 months since the video went viral on the goodwill the incident had generated for free? Nobody had a precise number. James had one anyway prepared in advance, and it was larger than the projected cost of the entire initiative by a wide margin. "I'm not asking you to approve this because it's the right thing to do, although it is," he'd told the board. "I'm asking you to approve it because the alternative is that we keep the goodwill from one lucky viral moment and do nothing to make sure the next Sandra Collins doesn't create the same crisis 6 months from now, except without a stranger's phone camera around to save us. This isn't charity, it's risk management with a conscience attached." The board had approved it 7-2, and Charlotte had heard the story secondhand and felt hearing it a fresh understanding of the particular way James Wilder got things done, never through force, always through the plain, patient architecture of a good argument delivered without theater, to people who respected numbers more than sentiment. Charlotte's graduation ceremony took place on a warm Saturday morning in May, in the same gymnasium where she'd attended 2 years of night classes after 12-hour shifts, dozing occasionally in the back row during lectures on labor law before catching herself and forcing her eyes back open. She'd walked across that stage in a cap and gown 2 sizes too large, rented from the campus bookstore, and had heard her own name called Charlotte Frost Hospitality Management with honors, and felt the particular vertigo of a promise she'd made to herself years ago finally actually completing itself. Lily had shouted from the audience the moment Charlotte's name was called, loud enough that the dean paused mid-sentence and the whole auditorium turned to look, and Charlotte had laughed so hard crossing the stage that she'd nearly tripped over the hem of her gown and hadn't cared even slightly. James had been in the 3rd row beside her sister, who'd driven up from Tulsa for the occasion, clapping with the specific, unguarded pride of a man who had learned over the past year to feel other people's victories as fully as his own. "You did that," he told her afterward in the parking lot. Lily perched on his shoulders, demanding to be lifted higher so she could see over the crowd. All of it. The classes, the program, the promotion. I want to be very clear that I know I didn't do any of that. I know you know, Charlotte said. That's kind of the whole point of you.
Mm.
On the night of her first shift as general manager after James and Lily had finished their dinner, the mac and cheese duly noted for the record, along with a dessert Lily insisted on ordering twice. Charlotte walked them both to the door herself. The same door she'd once walked through, fired and unfired within the same 10 minutes. The same door where a 5-year-old had once asked her mother if she was in trouble. Same time next week, James asked at the threshold. Lily, already half asleep against his shoulder, worn out from an evening of running through a dining room, she now considered with total confidence to be at least partially hers. Same time next week, Charlotte agreed. She watched them walk to the car under a Dallas sky gone deep blue-black with early evening streetlights just beginning to flicker on along McKinney Avenue, and thought standing there in the doorway of the restaurant that had once tried to make her disappear, and now bore her name on the manager's roster, about how strange the shape of a good life could turn out to be built, not from a single rescue, not from a single kind gesture at a dark moment, but from 1,000 smaller choices afterward made by two people who had both in their own ways insisted on doing things fairly. She turned back into the dining room where a party of 6 was waiting to be seated, and a busser was setting fresh water glasses at table 19 and got back to work. Charlotte's sister flew in for the graduation and stayed an extra 2 days, filling Charlotte's small apartment with the particular noise and warmth of family. Charlotte hadn't realized she'd been missing until it arrived late nights at the kitchen table, trading stories, her sister teaching Lily a clapping game their own mother had taught them 30 years earlier in a different kitchen in a different state. On her last night in town, sitting on Charlotte's fire escape with 2 glasses of wine between them, her sister had asked the question Charlotte had been waiting for since James first walked her sister and niece home from Marchetti's the previous June. "Is it real?" her sister asked. "Or is it one of those things that feels enormous because of how it started, and you're scared to look too closely at whether it'll hold up on a normal Tuesday?" "I've thought about that," Charlotte admitted. "A lot, actually. But I've watched him on 100 normal Tuesdays now. It's not the dramatic version of him I fell for. It's the version that shows up to a 5-year-old's family day in a shirt he clearly thought was nicer than it was, and argues seriously about paper leaves, and asks about my day like the answer actually matters to him after 11 hours of his own. That's not a rescue fantasy. That's just a person showing up over and over in the boring ways that actually count. That's the answer I was hoping for," her sister said and clinked her glass against Charlotte's.
But
Renata Cole, the panel judge who'd told Charlotte she'd run the cleanest recovery of the entire evaluation cycle, sent a card the week Charlotte's general manager promotion was announced. A short, handwritten note that Charlotte kept taped inside her desk drawer at the restaurant, reading it again on the hard days when the old doubt crept back in, the quiet fear that any of this could still be taken away. "I evaluate a lot of candidates who talk about hospitality, like it's customer service, with better lighting." The note read, "You're one of maybe 3 people I've scored in 15 years who actually understands it's about dignity. Don't let anyone talk you out of that, especially not yourself." Charlotte thought about that note often in the months that followed. Standing at the host stand on quiet Tuesday evenings, watching her dining room fill with the same gold light she'd first fallen in love with as a 24-year-old server who'd talked her way into a job with nothing but a transcript and a stubborn refusal to be told no twice. She thought about Sandra Collins sometimes too, though less often and without much bitterness left in it by the time a full year had passed. A woman who'd built her whole management style on the fear of losing status and lost everything. Anyway, the moment someone with actual power decided fear wasn't a management style worth keeping. Charlotte hoped in the distant, uncomplicated way you hope for people who've hurt you, and moved on that Sandra had found her way somewhere kinder, eventually to both herself and whoever she managed next. But mostly on those quiet Tuesday evenings, Charlotte thought about none of it at all. She thought about the seating chart and the 7:30 reservation that always ran late, and whether the new sommelier had finally figured out the Malbec situation, and whether Lily's homework was finished before James picked her up from the after-school program that Wilder Hospitality's Family Support Fund now quietly subsidized for a dozen other employees besides Charlotte herself. She had built in the 2 years since the worst night of her working life, an ordinary evening she got to have on purpose. It turned out to be the best thing she'd ever earned.